Can you see the slides?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think we started here and then stopped there, right? So we were trying to look how we can define crop, right? So it's different from plants, right? So we usually grow a population of plants and then for economical reasons, right? So that's how we define a crop, right? There are two components should be there. It should be a population of plants, and then we should get economically important crops, right? So that's the kind of objective we have in producing the crop, right? So these terms I want to make sure that you know this one, because often I know that the undergraduates they use different terms interchangeably, right? So that is not good, right? So because again and again we are going to use whatever the crop we study, okay? So if we take crop production, right? So that is total harvest of crops, right? Sometimes people confuse with production and productivity. That's different, right? So the productivity is the production per unit input, right? Input. It can be any input you can measure. If you taking land, right? That is one of the input. You can also take water, right? Fertilizer, labor, and capital, right? You can measure the productivity in terms of any input. That indicates the efficiency of agricultural production system, right? The productivity, when you say productivity, so that's an indicator of the efficiency, right? Why? Because it tells you how much you can produce per unit input, right? So even though you can measure, right, the productivity in terms of any input, right? Generally, we measure the productivity in terms of land, right? Land area. So these are the units we often use, right, to indicate the productivity. It can be kilogram per hectare, or tons per hectare, or bushels per acre, right? So this is not SI unit. This unit is an empirical unit, which is if we go to United States, they mostly use these empirical units, right? Not the SI units. So that's why I put it here, right? So different countries can use different units. Whatever it is, it generally measured in terms of per unit land area, right? So you should be able to, right, distinguish between production and productivity, right? Because you will be looking at different data sources, right? Where these data are presented, right? You should be able to distinguish, right, between the production and productivity, right? Production is the total harvest. It can be, this unit can be a kilogram or maybe tons, whatever it is, or bushels, right? The production can be that unit, but the productivity we measure usually per unit land area. Okay. And then let's move to the yield, right? We always talk yield, right? So what it is, right? So yield is you can define as an economically important portion of the crop, right? It can be directly or indirectly used for human consumption, right? So you can directly use, for example, fruits, right? And you can directly consume. But some other crops like rice, you need some sort of process, right? Some sort of processing, so you cannot consume directly. So the yield you can define like that. So that's the economically important portion, right? That is directly or indirectly used for human consumption. So commonly measured in terms of weight per unit land area, right? So it is similar to the productivity, but as I said, right, the productivity you can measure not necessarily to the land area, but to other inputs as well, right? Other inputs as well. because you may heard the terms like water use efficiency, right? Or fertilizer use efficiency, right? Within the fertilizer, we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, right? So those are the efficiency parameters that indicates the productivity, right? Per input, right? Per respective input. Okay, so when you move to the yield, right? There are two types. We will be talking, right? One is the potential yield, and then this actual yield, right? So we'll look at what it means. So before that, are there any questions on these things so far? So you have to respond yes or no, right? Otherwise, I don't know. Students, any questions?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. So let's look at what is potential yield, right? We said that the crop yield, there are two types, right? One is potential yield and actual yield, right? So the potential yield, it's kind of hypothetical one, right? Kind of hypothetical one because yield under ideal management and optimum environmental conditions, right? So if you provide right ideal management and optimum environmental conditions for that particular crop, so if that crop can produce yield, so that we can call as potential yield, right? That's the potential of that particular species, right? Or variety, right? But as you see, so in normal conditions, right? In the field conditions, it's very, very difficult for you to provide ideal management and optimum environmental conditions, right? So that's why I said it's a hypothetical one, right? And it's defined by the genetic potential of the crop or cultivar, right? So how much yield that particular genotype can produce, right? So that's what I mean by the genetic potential, right? So that is defined by the genetic potential because we assume that we provide ideal management and optimum environmental conditions, right? Is that clear to you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So, but most of the time, practical situation, what we get is the actual yield, right? So that is the yield we obtain under the actual field conditions, right? So the performance of the crop is affected by the biotic and abiotic stresses, right? Obviously, when you grow the crop in the field, they will face different stresses. So the biotic stresses can be pests, diseases, weeds, right? Then abiotic stresses like drought, right? Heat stress, salinity, right? So many stresses can be in the field, right? So in the field, you cannot make sure to provide the optimum environmental conditions for that crop, right? So it's kind of a more practical yield, right? We can get from the crops, right? Most of the time. So most of the time, what farmers get is the actual yield, right? And then there's a concept called yield gap, right? Yield gap, right? Now you know that what is potential yield and the actual yield, right? So the yield gap is just the difference, right? Just difference between the potential yield and the actual yield, okay? So according to your understanding, right? What kind of yield should be higher, you think?
Potential yield.
Yeah, that's correct, right? Because most of the time in the field, when we put the crop in the field, there will be a lot of stresses, right? Because of that, there's always yield reduction, right? There's always yield reduction. Because of that, actual yield will be lower than the potential yield, right? So always this potential yield is kind of hypothetical yield that could be larger than the actual yield, right? So we call this gap as a yield gap, right? So our management, right, should aim, right, for at least to some extent whether we can close this gap, right? So we can whether we can bring these two yields close, right? So in a way that we can reduce the yield gap, right? So that's up to management and other stuff, right? So that's kind of a food security related question, right? If we can produce a yield closer to the potential yield, that could be better, right? That could be better. So then your yield gap will be lower, right? So that's why we learn different management practices to intervene in a way that we can reduce this yield gap, right? So that's our objective, right? So I want make you to clear that why we study this stuff, right? Not for the theory, right? For the practical interventions, right? In a way that we can reduce the yield gap, that is better, right? We can produce more, right? Okay, so then there's something called biological yield and economical yield, right? So this also you should know because we will be studying, right? There's a parameter called harvest index. We will be talking, right? Harvest index for different varieties of rice, right? So you should know that, right? So the yield components, right, can be two types. Like you can differentiate them, like biological and economical, right? So if you take a crop, right, the total biomass produced by the particular crop, including roots, shoots, leaves, grains, fruits, etc., right? It's called as biological yield, right? That produces the total biomass, right? The total biomass. It includes everything, right? Everything for a crop. So that's called as biological yield. But the economical yield is the economically important portion only, right? For example, if you take rice, right, that's a grains only, the economically important portion we can see, right? So that portion is the economical yield for rice, right? If you take tomato, right, what we harvest is the fruits, right? So the fruits are the economically important portions, right? If you take potato crop, that's the tubers, right? So tubers we harvest, so that's the economically important portion. That makes the economical yield, right? So this parameter, right, that measures okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we were trying to understand what is harvest index, right? So it's a ratio, right? It's just the ratio because we now know that what is biological yield and what is economical yield, right? So it's the ratio between the economical yield and biological yield, right? So you can use this equation to derive, right? So bottom you put at the total biomass, right? At the top you will have the economical yield. In the case of rice, right, we put the grains weight, right? The weight of the grains, right? So the unit area from which you derive these both components should be the same, right? And then you should know that, right? So this particular parameter, as you see, if this HI value, right, the harvest index value is higher, obviously you will have a higher economical yield for that particular crop or variety, right? It varies across crops and varieties. And then another important thing you should know is that, right, the high quality crops like legumes, right? Why we call them as high quality crops is that legumes have protein, right, in them, right? And then if you take oilseed crops like groundnut or maybe sesame or sunflower, right? So those crops, right? Those crops will have lower harvest index. There's a reason for that. I will explain in a different steps, right? So there's a reason because their grain weight is low because of they want to produce, right, lot of high quality components including protein and oils, right? So that's why they have lower harvest index compared to the cereals, right? Or maybe the crops that produces yield with high carbohydrate content, right? So that's the reason. All right. So those kind of stuff I want you to introduce because I want to make sure that you are aware, because again and again we are going to use them, right? We are going to use those concepts. Is that clear? Are there any questions so far? Before we get into rice, any questions? So someone has to respond, please. Okay. Otherwise, because in Zoom it's very difficult whether the connection is okay or no. I don't know, right? Because when you respond, frequently, then only I can make sure that the connection is okay. Please.
No, sir.
Okay. So these are the topics we are going to cover for this talk, right? As I said earlier, right, it's a very important crop for us, right? So we'll go and have a look on some general introductory stuff, right? Rice, right? How it's originated, then its classification, right? And then what is the importance globally and also in Sri Lanka, right? How much we produce, right? Those kind of some general statistics we will have a look, and then we will study the rice improvement program in Sri Lanka, right? So it's very important, right? The rice is one of the earliest domesticated crop to Sri Lanka and also to the world, right? To the world. But, since this is the staple crop for Sri Lanka and for other countries as well, some other countries, right? Because of the increasing human population, we have to produce more, right? We have to produce more. So we worked on, right? The scientists have worked on several improvement programs, right? Mainly to increase the yield and also they reduce the pests, diseases, and then improve its management, right? Its management. When we think of improvement, the major improvement is through genetic interventions, right? Genetic interventions. So we will have a look, right? How this genetic intervention occurred. So it did not occur suddenly. So it took like decades, right, to improve the rice crop currently we have, right? So it took decades. In Sri Lanka, if you go back to the history, it started somewhere in 1930s, right? Even before the independence, we started working on this rice improvement program, right? Rice improvement program. So we will study that, right? So we will cover the important events, right, and how we came through, right, this improvement program to increase the yield before this president brought this ban on these agrochemicals, right, we were almost self-sufficient, right. That is because of this improvement program occurred in the country, right. People worked hard, right. So that we will study, and then we will go and study the growth phases of rice, right. Since it's important, right, you may know this word, right, what we mean by the growth phases, right. Right, the growth phases indicates the phenological changes, right, phenological changes, right. So whenever you take a crop, right, there are two things occur, right. One is the growth, right, that is the quantitative change, right. So that is the increase we see in the dry weight or biomass, right. So the other thing we see is that the phenological changes, those are qualitative changes, right. Qualitative changes, like, you can see the rice seeds, they germinate and then they grow, right. Then they go to flowering, and then they go to the maturity, and then in between they will have different phenological phases, right. So that we call as growth phases, right. So that we will study, because why we have to study is that in different growth phases, our management should be different, right. So the management should be targeted, right, with a requirement for rice crop in each growth phases, right. So that's why we study the growth phases, right, and also it determines the yield, right. So your management in different growth phases highly determine the yield. So that's very important for you, right. So we will study that, and then so once you cover these growth phases, then we will go to the economic management, right. So that, because I aligned in that way, because once you know the phases, right, growth phases, then it's better, what are the management practices should be targeted for each growth phase. Okay. And then finally, we will study the yield determination process, right? What are the factors controlling the yield of rice, and how we can intervene, right, to improve or increase the yield, right? That's our ultimate target, right, as scientists to study this one, right? So these are the topics will be covered in the coming lectures, right? So is that clear to you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So let's, so this is the introductory part. So now I am starting. So let's have a look on the origin and distribution, right, of rice crop, right? So where it's originated, right? Some sort of history we need to know, right? So kind of some brief understanding of this crop, right? So this crop, right, generally believed to be originated in South Central China, right? So that's most of the archaeologists they accept this, but there's a counter argument. If you go to India, right, Indian archaeologists they argue that the rice, this crop should have been originated in the Indus Valley, right? As part of, it was part of India, right? So, but generally accepted thing is that it has been originated somewhere in South Central China, right? South Central China. And then, this family and genus, you may have studied this classification, right? So the rice belongs to family Poaceae, right? Earlier, we call it as Gramineae. Now it's Poaceae, right? It's called as both the same, right? And the genus Oryza, right? Genus Oryza. And then, if you look back the history of this genus Oryza, it may be originated at least 130 million years ago, right? And it was dispersed, right, as a wild grass, right? So this Oryza genus earlier, it was a wild grass, wild type, right? In this particular landmass, right, we call it as Gondwana land, right? Gondwana land. So if you look, what is Gondwana land? It's a huge landmass. They call as supercontinent, right? So that finally broke up to, right, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, right? Currently we have these continents, right? So earlier all these continents were a single landmass, right? Landmass. So during that time, right, they believe that this genus, right, have been originated, right? So that's around 130 million years ago, right? So these wild types of rice, right, it's very old, right, very old. So if you take, right, how was the cultivation in South Asian countries, right? So the rice cultivation started, right, simultaneously, right, during the same period in many South Asian countries. So around 6,500 years ago, right? In many South Asian countries, this cultivation started, right? And then this particular genus, right, Oryza, right, genus Oryza has around 23 species, right, in which only we cultivate 2 species, right? Cultivated species are 2, right? But this genus has currently 23 species, right? 23 species. So we will look, right, how this cultivated varieties or cultivated species evolve, right? So up to now we are talking about the genus, right? How this the history of the genus, right? So when we go to the species, right, there are 2 species cultivated, right? So we will look how these 2 cultivated species evolve. Okay. So I said, right, we had the wild types, right, in this particular landmass that's called as Gondwana land, right? So currently this landmass is now drifted apart, right, from Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, right? So they are divided, right? So this is the common ancestor, right? So we said here, right, the wild grass belongs to genus Oryza is the ancestor, right? Ancestor of this cultivated rice, right? Cultivated rice. So when they divide when this landmass divide, right? So this evolution happened differently in 2 different places, right? So one is dominantly in the Asia and Southeast Asia, right? In the left side, you can see that category. But if you go to the right side, right, that is in Africa and West Africa, right? So right now, earlier this landmass was a large landmass, a single continent, right? Now it's divided, right, drifted apart, right? So the evolution occurred differently in 2 different places, right? 2 different places. So this in Asia, what we had was that the wild perennial type. Earlier we had in Asia is the Oryza rufiposa, right? So it's called as Oryza rufiposa. But if you go to the Africa and West Africa, what was there was Oryza party or Oryza longistaminata, right? So this is the type wild perennial, right? Wild perennial started in these 2 different places, right? And then from them, right? From each of them, what we had is the so you can see, right? The earliest one was the perennial type, right? Perennial type, wild type. Wild type perennial means I hope you know the difference between annual and perennial, right? Annual and perennial. So if you want to remind you, right, the annuals are the crops, right? They complete their life cycle within 1 year, right? Within 1 year, but perennial, so they grow for long, right? They can grow more than 5-6 years. Sometimes some crops, like you will have the perennial trees, like they will grow for years, right? So that's what we call as perennial. So you should know the ancestor was a perennial, right? Ancestor of the rice was a perennial. How it was perennial was that they have, they had in the root system called as rhizomes, right? Rhizomes, like, kind of a small tuber-like structures. Like, I hope you know those botanical names, right? The rhizomes we call, right? So they can survive for years. So that's how the rice crop originated. It was a perennial, and most importantly, currently we grow rice as a lowland crop, right? But it's originated as the upland crop, right? So it was originated as an upland crop, right? We converted it into lowland crop, right? Okay, so from that, right, we had these wild annual types, right? So from wild perennial types, the wild annual types evolved, right? So that's called, for the, in the Asia and Southeast Asia, we had the Oryza nivara, right? But if you go to this Africa, right, that's Oryza breviculata, right? So that's evolved. So that it's annual, right? Now it's evolved into annual, right? So it was perennial, right? It was producing seeds and it had rhizomes, right? So they can survive for years, right? So from that, right, it evolved into annual. So now seed production, right, producing from seeds, right? So from that, right, from that, in the Asia and Southeast East Asia, we had the Oryza sativa, right? Oryza sativa. So that is the cultivated type rice in Asia and Southeast Asia, right? Oryza sativa. So don't look here. There are two types of Oryza sativa we have. We will look that later, right? Later. So in the Southeast Asia, but we had the cultivated one is the Oryza sativa. But in Africa, the same cultivated type evolved was Oryza glabrini, right? Oryza glabrini. But in Asia, if you come to the Asia, right, there are the Oryza sativa, that's the cultivated rice, had two types, right? Had two types. So as here you can see that's Oryza sativa indica and Oryza sativa japonica, right? Japonica, right? We will look the difference. So we will look the difference. So these are the cultivated types, right? So now, so this is only, so I can take a pen, right? So when you take about, we told that, right? So the genus Oryza, right? So this is the genus Oryza has like 23 species. Among them, only 2 are cultivated, right? So the cultivated species are here. The first one, that's Oryza sativa, right? That's in Asia and Southeast Asia. And then we have the second one, Oryza glabrima in Africa, right? So that's the second one. So don't confuse, like we have 3, right? So these are types, right? These are types of this Asian species, right? These are 2 types of Asian species. So that type name comes after the species, right? Indica, and then we have japonica, right? So these are just types. So if you are asked, right, what are the 2 cultivated species, so you have to write this, right? This is the first one, Oryza sativa. Second one is Oryza glabrina, right? Is that clear to you?
Yes, sir.
Are there any questions? So if you have any questions, you can ask. And because this is very important classification, and then you should know this pathway, right? How the cultivated rice evolved. Okay. So that's why I put here that's cultivated, right? So there are 2 species. So this Asian species, that's Oryza sativa, has 2 types. So one is indica and then japonica, right? So if that is clear, then we can move to the next one. So we look right these the species, these different species, only the cultivated species, right? We don't want to know the other species, right? I mean the wild types, right? For now, right? For now, we don't need to know, but we will have a look on the cultivated types. Okay. So as I said, right, this first species, that's the Asian species, has two types, right? So we will look both, right? We will look both, but the African species has only one, right? Okay, so if you take the Oryza sativa, that is the type indica, right? If you go here, this one, okay. So that is mostly distributed, right, across Asia, right? So in Asian countries, what we mostly have is this type, right, Oryza sativa, but the type indica, right? So that's why it's commonly called as Asian rice, right? Asian rice. If you look at the characteristics, right? So it's a non-sticky, right? Long grain type varieties. So most of the rice we grow across Asia, right? Including Sri Lanka, right? This one, right? Oryza sativa type indica, okay? So it's non-sticky, right? And then long grain type varieties. So this one first introduced to Sri Lanka in around like 513 BC, right? That during that time, very old, right? So this is introduced to the country, right? So these are the characteristics, and then you should know about this particular type of Oryza sativa is commonly grown in Asian countries, right? But if you go to this the second type, right, that's the japonica type, right? So that is actually originated in central China, right? And then extensively cultivated in East Asia, right? Especially countries like China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, right? Indonesia, right? Those countries, they grow this particular type, right? Especially in the East Asia, right? So these grains, right? If you compare with the indica type, right? What we grow in Sri Lanka, this one, right? So if you compare them, right, with that, they are like they are not long grains, right? They are like round shape, but a little bit harder than what we have here, right? And they also stickier, right? This is the important character. You can differentiate. This japonica types are stickier, right? The reason is that they have that in the grains higher content of amylopectin, right? So this particular component is the reason for that sticky nature of those types, right? But if you take the indica, right? Indica, the grains mostly have the amylose, not the amylopectin, right? So mostly they have amylose. So that's why they don't have that sticky nature. But if you take this japonica one, right? So they are stickier because of that high amylopectin content, right? And then if you look the morphology, right, of the crop, right, these crops, right, japonica varieties, they are shorter than this indica type rice crop, right? So usually they are shorter, right? Shorter crops. So that's another morphological difference in the crops, right? So this one has three subgroups, right? three subgroups you can find in this type. Again, subgroup, right? So the japonica type, you can again find three subgroups, right? Three subgroups. So the first one is the temperate one, right? Temperate japonica, right? So temperate climate means like, I hope you know, maybe you have studied in the principles of crop production, right? These terms temperate and tropical, right? So the temperate climate is that it's kind of a cool climate, right? The areas a little bit away from the equator, right? So when the regions are far from the equator, right, mostly, so we'll have less solar radiation, right? So the climate will be more or less cooler, right? Cooler climate, right? Especially in the north and south, right? If you go to the go towards the northern or southern hemisphere, right, you will have this temperate climate. But tropical is the climate similar to us, right? What we have in Sri Lanka, right? So we are close to equator, right? So we have a warmer and hotter climate, right? So that we tell as tropical, right? So I hope that you are aware, right? So this temperate japonica, right, is cultivated in these following countries, right? China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan, where they have a little bit of kind of a temperate climate. If you go especially in the northern China, right, or Korea, right, or Japan, right. So they will have this temperate climate. So they have this temperate japonica, right. So they cultivate this one, right. So that's why, because of we said that this japonica type, right, japonica type rice are stickier, right? We said stickier. That's why you may have seen the people in these countries, like in China, Japan, when you go to Korea, right? They will use those sticks, right, to eat, right? But that may not be suitable for our rice varieties because that will not stick to those kind of sticks, right? They use to eat, right? So their rice is stickier. That's why they use that, right? So that's kind of a reason why they use that, right? And then the tropical japonica, the japonica type that's cultivated predominantly in tropical countries, it's called as also called as javanica, right? It's also called as javanica, right? Sometimes they name as like Oryza, sativa, japonica, or javanica, right? So without japonica also they will use javanica, right? Don't confuse. It's a type of it's a subgroup of this one, right? It's a subgroup of japonica that's mainly grown in countries like Indonesia and Madagascar, right? They have some tropical climate, right? So that's the second subgroup, right? Second subgroup. The third one is the aromatic, right? So these types they have a distinguishable aroma, right? In their eyes, right? Aroma is kind of a like so flavor that can give, right? So they have aromatic components. So because of that, we put them under this subgroup, right? Aromatic one, right? So these are the three subgroups, right? We have under this japonica type, right? Japonica type. So we have 1, 2, 3. Okay. Is that clear to you? Are there any questions so far? Any questions? Students, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you can ask anything, right? Now we have covered, right? So this, right now we have covered this the Asian type, right? Asian type. So we said that this particular landmass was a single large landmass, and then it divided into continents, right? So the evolution took place differently in two different places. One is in Asia and Southeast Asia, and then the Africa and West Africa. Those are the two regions. And then the evolution occurred. Like earlier, we had the wild perennials, right? From that, what is evolved was the wild annuals, right? From that, we have the cultivated species. So the cultivated species, there are two, right? One is in Asia, that's Oryza sativa. So the second one is in Africa, that's Oryza glabrima, right? And then in Asia, right, the Oryza sativa species has two types, right? One is Oryza sativa indica, and then second one is the japonica, right? So that's kind of a summary, right? Summary you should know, right? So how this evolution occurred, right? In two different places. Earlier we had wild types; those are wild perennials, and then we had wild annuals, and then from that we have cultivated types, right? So now we are looking. We were looking these two types, right? How they are different, right? Because that's important now. Because these are the Oryza sativa species is the dominant one, mostly grown in Asia, right? Including Sri Lanka, right? So we have these two types. So we were looking at their characteristics, and then we were trying to understand how they are different, right? So the Oryza sativa indica is the one we grow in Sri Lanka, right? So this is the one Sri Lankan varieties belongs to Oryza sativa indica. But if you go to the East Asia, this is the one you will find. Okay. If you go to especially Japan, Korea, right, Thailand, right, Vietnam, right, those countries, China, right, but not as a whole. Like sometimes if you go to China, right, sometimes they will have both, right. In the northern China, they can have japonica, and then in the south, they might have the indica varieties as well, right. So it's not like they grow only one type, right. They can grow mix as well, right. But here, this is the cultivated species. In Africa, we have, right. So the next we will have a look on that, right. Okay, so we'll have 5 minutes more. So I will quickly look at that one. Okay. Okay, so this is the glabrima, right? That's the Africa, the cultivated species in Africa, right? So that's why it's called by itself. It's called as African rice, right? First domesticated and grown in West Africa, right? West Africa. So they are like, you can imagine the climate conditions and soil conditions in Africa. It's very harsh, right? They experience frequent droughts and all sort of stresses, right? So that's how you can imagine the country, right? Not only the country, that the region, right? The region is very vulnerable to the stresses, right? So the type or species domesticated there should have some sort of right tolerance to such environmental conditions, right? So that's why they are hardy, right? And also comparatively, right? When you compare with the Oryza sativa, they are pest resistant, and also they are less labor intensive, right? So that means the care is required at less amount, right? And when you compare with, always the comparison, right? So when you compare with the sativa, right? So they are hardy, pest resistant, and less labor intensive compared to Asian rice, like Asian rice. So that is the Oryza sativa, right? That's the Oryza sativa. They are hardy and resistant. And then production of African rice. So even though this is a dominant, this was right, dominant species in most of the African countries, including West Africa, right? So currently, this production of this rice is declined because the cultivation is replaced with most of the Asian varieties. They are high yielding because there's not that much improvement. I mean, the yield improvement programs targeted for this African rice species, right? So most of the improvement occurred for this Oryza sativa, right? That's the Asian type. So since they wanted to introduce high yielding varieties, now the production of African rice, this particular Oryza glaberrima is decreasing in this region. Currently around 20%, right? 20% is of the rice produced with this particular species. If you go to West Africa, right, you can find now around 20% produced, 20% of the rice produced from this species, right? And also another important thing, right? So about this particular species, right? There's a variety called Carolina Gold, right? Carolina Gold. So this is the earliest introduced and cultivated variety in the United States, right? So that one belongs to this species, right? So why they called as Carolina Gold is that the earliest production in the United States started in Carolinas, right? When you take Carolinas, so we have two provinces, right? Two states in the United States. One is the North Carolina and South Carolina, right? So where these rice cultivation started, but now they no more cultivate in the Carolinas. So they moved to the states like Arkansas, like Texas, and California, right? So rice is cultivated. Even though United States, you look like you may think it's always winter. It's not the case, right? If you go to the south of the United States, they have tropical climate. If you go to Florida, right? If you go to Texas, if you go to California, that's a total different climate, right? So the United States has a mixture of states with a mixture of climate and soil, right? So when they have a kind of a climate closer to tropics, they grow rice, but little extent, but they grow rice. But their earliest rice they introduced to Carolinas, like North Carolina or South Carolina, right? Belongs to this species, right? Belongs to this species. All right. So with that, I will finish today's class. Are there any questions?